Do you want to be ahead of the game for the latest in arts, music, cuisine, and entertainment across the Middle East's most dynamic capital cities? Al Monitor is proud to launch our City Pulse newsletters, focused exclusively on local news, starting in Riyadh, Dubai, Istanbul, and Doha. Each week, our on-the-ground writers in these cities cover the latest cultural happenings and trends, so you have everything you need to know for the best local experiences. To subscribe for free, go to almonitor.com, that's al-monitor.com, and sign up on our newsletter page.
Welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief. I'm Adam Lucente. The UK removed sanctions on 24 Syrian entities on Thursday, including the central bank, other financial institutions, and energy companies. The sanctions date back to when Syrian President Bashar al-Assad was in power. Syria's Assad was sanctioned by Western states over his government's conduct in the civil war, but Assad was ousted in a rebel offensive in December, and the Islamist former rebel group Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, or HTS, is now leading a transitional government. That transitional government is now asking the international community for the Assad-era sanctions to be lifted so the country can rebuild. The UK has now removed some of those sanctions, though others remain in place. The European Union likewise lifted several sanctions on Syria last month. The US, however, has yet to make such a move, aside from an aid-related exemption in January. Amidst all this are concerns about human rights in the new Syria, particularly with regards to religious minorities and HTS's past as a jihadist group, as well as escalating violence between pro-Assad forces and the transitional government that left dozens dead on Thursday. In this episode, we hear from Al Monitor's chief business correspondent, Jack Dutton. Jack and I spoke on Thursday, shortly after the British government announcement, about which Syrian entities received sanctions relief, why the UK is lifting the sanctions now, the state of the Syrian economy, and how the British action compares to the EU's removal of sanctions on Syria. Towards the end, we discuss what to expect from the US under President Trump with regards to Syria sanctions. Hope you enjoy. Jack, welcome back to the Al Monitor Brief.
Great to be back on the podcast, Adam.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. So the first question is, what sanctions exactly did the UK remove on Syria?
The United Kingdom removed sanctions on 24 Syrian entities and unfroze their assets. Among these entities included the Central Bank of Syria, as well as other banks and petroleum companies, as well as General Organization of Tobacco and Syrian Arab Airlines. The move, I guess, comes as the West continues to ease financial restrictions on Syria following a change in leadership in December, which I'll go into more detail in a while. But among the companies which were removed from the sanctions list included, as well as the central bank, the Commercial Bank of Syria, the Agricultural Cooperative Bank, Syrian Petroleum Company, Syria Trading Oil Company, Overseas Petroleum Trading, and as I said, Syrian Arab Airlines and General Organization of Tobacco.
And just a quick follow-up, is there any reason you think why these specific companies were targeted for the removing of the sanctions? It seems like it's a lot of financial entities.
Yeah, definitely. So in a statement after the announcement, the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office said that these entities were previously used under the Assad regime to fund the oppression of the Syrian people, and the Assad family had an iron-fisted rule over Syria for over 5 decades. So now there's the interim government, and the British government clearly sees these entities as ones which were used by the former regime to oppress the Syrian people and now don't pose as much of a threat.
And you alluded to it earlier, but why did the UK decide to make this move now?
So the Syrian economy has been on its knees from a 13-year civil war, which has been raging since 2011. And that's cost, according to UN estimates, around 800 billion for the country. And on top of this, the EU and US imposed sanctions in May 2011, which prohibited the trade of goods that the West said could be used to repress Syrian civilians by the government. The new government now is trying to make the right noises. The new interim government, led by HTS leader Ahmed al-Sharaa, has promised to respect human rights and rebuild the country. And to convince the international community to lift sanctions that have been placed since the civil war erupted in 2011, the new administration has been engaging with foreign leaders and rebuilding ties to attract international investment. I was in Davos in January, And we had Syria's foreign minister, Shabani, visit, and he was the most senior Syrian lawmaker to have ever visited the World Economic Forum, where he engaged with top leaders. And he even said then that he'd been engaging with the Trump administration, no doubt one of the main topics being the relief of sanctions. And on February the 11th, Shabani went to Paris and led a delegation to meet EU leaders. And that was the first trip of the new governments to Europe since Assad's ouster. And in January as well, Syria's top diplomat, along with the country's defense minister and head of intelligence, visited Saudi Arabia to strengthen bilateral relations in the Gulf state too. So I think this kind of approach underscores what the UK government anyway said, is that the approach kind of underscores kind of positive signals by the new government that they're looking to rebuild the country and economy, including kind of through a support for the Syrian-led and Syrian-owned political transition process. However, they did caveat it by saying we continue to judge Syria's interim authorities by their actions and not their words, because HTS, if you look at their history in Idlib, the last kind of rebel stronghold in northern Syria, they are an Islamist group and have links as well. Their leader has links to Al-Qaeda in Iraq and was very senior and head of Al-Qaeda Iraq as well. So there's a lot of skepticism from the West, but so far the government has been saying all the right things. And I guess it remains to be seen whether they will walk the walk as well as talk the talk. But I think Syria's economy is in such dire straits. They're kind of in need to woo the international community and try and get some of these sanctions lifted.
And in terms of Europe in a more wider sense, how does the British action of lifting sanctions compare to the EU's decisions to lift the Syria sanctions of their own?
Both the EU and the UK have sanctions on Syria's illicit Captagon drug trade and also on chemicals, chemical industries which have been used to make chemical weapons, which the former regime has been accused of using on its people. So those sanctions remain in place. We saw the European Union suspend several sanctions on February the 24th across banking, energy, and transport. And some of the names of the entities we saw with their funds unfrozen were similar to what are the same ones of what we saw today. So Syrian Arab Airlines, Agricultural Cooperative Bank were kind of previously subject to asset freezes. But when I had to compare the two, it seems the EU kind of went further than the UK because it also introduced exemptions to its prohibition on banking relations between Europe and Syria and allow kind of transactions in these sectors, strategic sectors like energy and transport, as well as humanitarian and reconstruction purposes. And the EU also extended the existing exemption for certain EU-based humanitarian organizations to carry out their work in Syria. So it felt a lot more comprehensive than the UK measures. However, the UK Foreign Office was quite tight-lipped about it today. When I tried to get in touch with them, they didn't really provide much more detail apart from the names of these 24 entities which have been removed from the list. So on the face of it, it seems that the EU is far more comprehensive, but there's a lot of overlap in terms of the companies now which have more financial freedom in Syria. And as I said, there's still these kind of key sanctions on the chemical weapons sector, and illicit drug sanctions remain in place, and some other sanctions on things like the arms trade, dual use goods, and software for surveillance, which you're seeing from both the EU and the UK.
Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with Jack Dutton after this short break.
Today's transformation of the Middle East is at the center of global geopolitics. Whether you're an analyst, diplomat, executive, or academic, you need the best reporting and analysis to understand what's really happening on the ground and what it means for the world. Al-Monitor is the award-winning independent leader in Middle East news. From Riyadh to Beirut, Abu Dhabi to Doha, and Baghdad to Tehran, our team of over 100 expert journalists report daily on the top stories driving the regional trends. Download our mobile app and subscribe to Al-Monitor to follow what leaders and decision-makers are reading every day. Go to almonitor.com, that's AL-MONITOR.com, and use promo code POD25, POD25, for a discount.
Okay, we're back. Jack, this last question I'll chime in on myself at the end, but do you think the UK and the EU removing sanctions on Syria could influence the US to do the same?
While traditionally you would see the US kind of act in concert with the EU and the UK on such moves of relieving sanctions, it kind of remains to be seen with the Trump administration. Given when you look at other major kind of foreign policy challenges and conflicts in the region, the kind of disagreement when it comes for the plan for the day after with Gaza and the ceasefire. And when you look back on what Trump has said, previously he said he's a very hands-off approach when it comes to Syria. And he said previously that we're not involved in Syria. Syria is its own mess. So he did not mince words of that. And it seems to me that he's a lot more standoffish when it comes to doing that. However, we have seen some movement in January. The US granted some short-term waivers related to the provision of basic services in response to requests for sanctions relief from Syria. And you've obviously had a lot of pressure from the new administration as well as EU diplomats for the US to kind of also relieve some sanctions.
Yeah, for me, it seems that Syria's not, like you said, not a major priority for the Trump administration. I mean, Secretary of State Rubio has expressed some concerns about the new government from a security terrorism point of view, but compared to Gaza, Iran, and then outside the region, Ukraine, China, and the tariffs, that seems to be more where the administration is looking at. And, I would just add that a lot of world leaders have called Syrian interim President Ahmed Shara, but Trump has not. And as we've reported at Al Monitor, Europe sees Syria as very important to its own stability because of the history of migration during the Civil War. But the US, that's less the case.
Definitely. And the Trump administration, I don't believe, has explicitly stated its intention to lift sanctions, though it is probably open to that possibility, but conditions would have to be met. And you've seen with Trump's quite aggressive approach to diplomacy, like you mentioned with Ukraine, it's very much remains to be seen how the US will act.
Yeah, exactly. Jack, thanks so much for your time today, and we look forward to more of your reporting.
Thanks very much, Adam.
Thanks for listening to the Al Monitor Brief. Be sure to follow Al Monitor for more on the stories impacting the Middle East. Until next time, I'm Adam Lucente.